On April 1st, 1957, the BBC current affairs program Panorama ran a 3-minute spot of respected war reporter Richard Dimbleby dryly reporting on the bountiful Swiss harvest of spaghetti from the spaghetti trees that year, helped along by the virtual disappearance of the so-called spaghetti weevil. After the airing, hundreds of calls came into the BBC asking how viewers could grow their own spaghetti at home, to which the BBC replied, quote, "Place a sprig of spaghetti in a tin of tomato sauce and hope for the best," unquote. This gag worked because at the time, despite being fairly common, pasta was considered a foreign delicacy in Great Britain. It also helped that the broadcast presented itself in a clear and sober manner, never winking at the audience or admitting that it was a satirical hoax. It is today considered one of the greatest April Fool's jokes of all time, and it often finds itself on lists of greatest media hoaxes, alongside the famous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast and the infamous 1992 Ghostwatch mockumentary. It was on one such list that I first heard about the subject of today's video, an April Fool's joke so convincing that to this very day there are people who think it is more fact than fiction. And the scary part is, they might just be right.
All you'll ever be.
There was nothing we could do to cut either world population or the consumption of resources. Alternative 3 was a much more limited option.
By 1977, 20 years after the spaghetti harvest, the writer David Ambrose was a rising star, having written for journals, film, television, and the stage to much success. He had also worked with and befriended Orson Welles, perhaps the world's most famous mockumentarian. He was conceiving of a script for Anglia Television about mysterious disappearances that, with the help of esteemed film director Christopher Miles, he turned into a mockumentary of his own called Alternative 3. It was this little April Fool's joke that finally put David Ambrose over the top and set the course for the rest of his career, where among other things, he would work on previously covered sci-fi classics Star Trek the Motion Picture and The Final Countdown. And now I have that song stuck in my head again. Presenting itself as a special episode of a series called Science Report, which, for the record, did not previously exist, Alternative 3 starts as a discussion of a startling brain drain throughout not just Great Britain, but the entire world. This quickly spirals out into an uncovering of a wide-ranging conspiracy involving catastrophic global climate change, suspicious deaths of prominent figures, the entire Apollo moon program being a smokescreen to hide a much larger operation on the dark side of the moon, and ultimately a plan to take the world's best and brightest somewhere else. The title comes from the idea that, in some smoky room decades prior, 3 ideas had been proposed for dealing with climate change. The first alternative to the end of the human race was to be the partial destruction of the ozone layer in order to release much of the Earth's captured carbon dioxide, which was deemed too problematic. The second was to be a mass migration to a cave system built beneath the surface, which was deemed an incomplete solution. And the third was a Noah's Ark-style plan to put a handful of people on the surface of Mars. Anglia, Miles, and Ambrose believed that, in conjunction with a planned release date of April Fool's Day 1977, it was preposterous enough that nobody would actually fall for it. Or at least, that's what they claim now.
Hey, have you hit that like button yet? If not, I'd really appreciate it if you did. And if you really do like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing as well. If you want to support what I do even more, you can also check out my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. I also have a bunch of other things to promote, like my book, my podcasts, my website, and my Discord server, which are all linked in the description below. With all that out of the way, let's move on.
To lend Alternative 3 an air of dry dignity, they hired the broadcaster and future MP Tim Brinton as the show's presenter, credited as himself, but having his character renamed to Simon Butler in the subsequent book by Leslie Watkins that I'll talk about later. Just like Richard Dimbleby's matter-of-fact discussion of Swiss spaghetti crops 2 decades earlier, Brinton makes the entire show work, gives it just enough gravitas for even the casual skeptics in the audience to put their guard down. As the lead investigator and reporter of the series, Colin Benson, they cast Gregory Monroe, a television actor who would have been known to British audiences at the time as Kenny from The Siege of Golden Hill. And as the secondary reporter, Catherine White, they cast Carol Hazel, a lesser-known television actress with only a few soaps to her credit. The most familiar face for me, however, is that of the paranoiac retired Apollo astronaut Bob Groden, played by Shane Rimmer of Rollerball and The Spy Who Loved Me fame. Other actors worth noting include future Allo Allo regular Richard Marner as Dr. Gerstein, future Thomas Wayne David Baxt as Harry, and the future multiple award-winning actress Phoebe Nichols as Harry's girlfriend Wendy. To make the entire thing feel more authentic, many actors were deliberately directed to act in a stilted manner, with Richard Marner even admitting to having purposefully neglected his line memorization. They also wanted the film to look worn and splice it seamlessly with actual NASA recordings and real documentary footage. As such, most of the film was sent back to the lab to have scratches and imperfections added on, and to have it processed multiple times to make it look damaged and degraded, much to the bewilderment of the technicians. As for the music, it was put together by Brian Eno, a now legendary figure in electronic and ambient music. He published his Alternative 3 theme on his 1978 album Music for Films, which, if you're into unsettling ambient electronica, is really good. Despite initial plans to air on April 1st, Alternative 3 actually aired on Anglia TV on the 20th of June 1977. I've come across a couple of different explanations for this, from a simple scheduling error to a labor dispute, but either way, even a title card at the end announcing the April 1st air date wasn't enough to convince people that it was all a joke. Apparently, calls came in to Anglia and even to the authorities about the program, and for some people, the harder it was denounced as a joke by the people in charge, the harder they believed in the conspiracy. To be fair, just like with Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio show before it, a lot of this might have just been publicity and fodder for the papers during a slow news cycle. Now, if you look online for information about Alternative 3, you'll come across a lot of wild claims that the film was banned, rejected by international markets as dangerous, and caused an uproar in other places like Australia and Canada. But when it comes to this film, trust me, take everything the internet says with a hefty spoonful of salt. I've tried to parse through the noise and verify what really happened, but honestly, going down that rabbit hole kinda spoils the fun. Regardless, the show did have an immediate cultural impact far greater than was expected by all involved. Both David Ambrose and Christopher Miles got career boosts from all the publicity, and Alternative 3 still pops up in lists of famous hoaxes and April Fool's pranks, which, like I said before, is how I found it. Allegedly, all of the original copies of the film, along with all of the legal paperwork for it, were lost in a fire, but director Christopher Miles did retain his own 16mm print that was used for its DVD restoration in the mid-noughts. It may or may not be in the public domain, but even if it's not, copyright bots, this is still fair use. Alternative 3 also pops up in low-key pop culture now and then, often name-dropped by rock bands like Anathema and Monster Magnet, and getting heavily referenced in Richard Linklater's Slacker.
Anyway, it's a sci-fi movie called Alternative 3.
It's also inspired books of dubious quality, and a follow-up mockumentary called Packing for Mars that I haven't seen before because, well, it doesn't look very good. Going back to not long after the original airing of Alternative 3, though, a book, also titled Alternative 3, was published by somebody named Leslie Watkins. It digs a lot deeper into the conspiracies and recounts a fictionalized version of the behind-the-scenes making of the film. I'm almost 100% certain that Leslie Watkins is just a pseudonym for David Ambrose, but the book vehemently denies that. Personally, I highly recommend this book if you've seen Alternative 3, because it is a wildly entertaining companion piece. It presents the whole thing as a kind of grand unified conspiracy theory that goes as crazy as you want it to, bringing in UFOs, spontaneous human combustion, the Bermuda Triangle, and a whole lot more. I'm kind of disappointed that Bigfoot never shows up. But if that makes you roll your eyes, don't worry. It's got a great sense of humor about things, and I gotta say I laughed out loud when I got to a section where a bunch of Jesus-loving hippies make an exceptionally random appearance near the end. But do I think there's any truth to Alternative 3? Not really, to be honest, but I respect the heck out of Ambrose for doing his research. Apparently, while working on the initial idea, he talked to one of the science guys at Anglia who told him about the greenhouse effect and the theory of out-of-control global warming, something not many people were talking about in the 1970s, and he incorporated that into his story, not because he was an environmental advocate or anything like that, but simply because it was the perfect narrative pretext. There is a lot of science undergirding the story of Alternative 3, way more than it has any business having, and the story itself, building on the verisimilitude of real science, also preys on deeply ingrained paranoia and anxiety about the modern world. Sure, it was meant as a joke, and if you take it that way, it is possible to laugh about it, but it also strikes a very real and very sensitive nerve. I don't doubt that there are loads of people who can watch something like this and think it's real, and I'm not the kind of guy to try to convince you otherwise. Believe whatever you like. Look, if you'll allow me to be political for a second, I personally believe that fears of disinformation are a cynical moral panic that is all too easily used as a pretext for government intervention and censorship. It reveals an inherent lack of faith in people, which in turn reveals an inherent lack of faith in any form of democracy. As a believer in free speech and democracy, I have little patience for that kind of nonsense, and I will not hesitate to argue that things like Alternative 3 should be celebrated, should be allowed to flourish in the spaghetti fields of liberty. Moral panics be damned. I say all that, not just because I have this soapbox lying around, but because there is a subtext to Alternative 3 about the dissemination of information, about how quickly the drive to solve the world's problems turns towards repression and evil. It's made even clearer in the book, which talks about armies of lobotomized undesirables being used as a slave labor force for the Martian colonies, but it's also present in the show, which discusses people having their lives ruined or being permanently silenced by shadowy forces. It ends with our presenter urging those in power to share their information with the public, to allow humanity to work as one instead of working solely for the benefit of an all-powerful elite. And that's a strong message that resonates into the modern world, where the climate fears only used as a plot device in the film are becoming all the more real with every passing year. Maybe my politics are showing a bit too much, but like the presenter, I believe we can only solve dire problems like these through encouraging innovation, cultivating free expression, and rewarding cooperation, not through stifling industry, silencing unpopular opinions, and leaning into political division. So that is why I want to highlight Alternative 3, because even if it is faded into relative obscurity for most of us, it deserves to be recognized as an important piece of media, to be recognized, unforgettably, as a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite mockumentary? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to smash those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll hang out with the old folks down in St. Petersburg, Florida, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anyone.
There's always the chance of a late frost, which, while not entirely ruining the crop, generally impairs the flavor.